Hi, this is Pastor Barry with the supplement video for Mark 15, the discussion entitled, Can the King Save Himself? And of course, the short answer to that question is yes and no. He certainly has the power to save his own life, but he's kind of caught in this situation where if he does save his life, they've taunted him, telling him that if he'll come down off the cross and save himself, that they'll believe in him. But if he does that, then he doesn't save us. And so this is the bind for Jesus, is he can save himself, but if he does, then he can't fulfill the purposes for which he was sent by the Father, the purposes for which he came. I'm going to kind of talk generally about the study. I'm going to try not to talk about each individual question. I think the study is fairly well written in terms of helping you to make your way through the passage. So I'm going to just try to include some background information that you may or may not know, and to encourage you in places to look and discover more. First of all, this is one of those passages that we try to include a creative way for opening up the passage. The creative way in this case is thinking about yourself as a photographer. How would you tell this story if you were a photojournalist? What pictures would you need to have, and what would be in them? And what do they tell you about the death of Jesus and about what it means, possibly? You're going to want to have some information about crucifixion. Some of the people in your group will know a lot about crucifixion. Some of them won't know hardly anything about crucifixion, except possibly that it involves killing someone on the cross. I encourage you, whether you know a lot or a little, to look up more information, to look in the New Bible Dictionary at the article on crucifixion, especially at the end. It's a really helpful paragraph about crucifixion and about who it was for and what it meant to them. In brief, I can kind of summarize here. Crucifixion was a mode of execution, but not just for anybody. It was such a horrible way to die. It was humiliating. It was like torturing someone to death, that it was reserved for the worst criminals, which they thought of as people like revolutionaries, people that were trying to overthrow the government. It was done on a cross, and it was often done when the person was naked. Like I said, it was meant to humiliate so that people would know not to do whatever it was that person was doing that got them crucified. Something that's important to know as you read through this passage is that the Jews commonly referred to a whole psalm by quoting the first verse. It would be a little bit, or first line. It would be a little bit like when we say something like a stitch in time, and some people will know that the end of that old proverb is saves nine. You don't have to quote the whole proverb. You can just quote the beginning, and people know that you mean the whole thing. Well, the Jews did a similar thing with the Psalms. Rather than like reciting the entire psalm, they would recite just the first line, but everybody knew that you were referencing the whole psalm. And the psalm that's important in this passage is Psalm 22. Jesus quotes the first line of Psalm 22 on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? And, preachers and some scholars have made a big deal out of how, Jesus has been separated from the Father because of our sin, and the Father can't look upon him. And so the first time ever, he is abandoned by the Father. I think there are a lot of questions about whether that kind of interpretation holds up theologically. Like, can the Father ever really turn his back on Jesus? But also, is it a culturally appropriate way of interpreting this text? If Jesus is referring to all of Psalm 22, how might we understand this passage? And if you read Psalm 22, you'll find that from that horrible beginning, my God, Why have you forsaken me? And a fairly detailed description of crucifixion, even though it happened, even though Psalm 22 was written hundreds of years before they knew anything about crucifixion. So it's a prophetic psalm. It ends much more hopeful and much more full of faith and trust and victory than it begins. And if we take that seriously, if we read the whole psalm, and I encourage you to do that in your group, to read the whole psalm, if we understand what happens to Jesus on the cross in light of that psalm, how might we interpret Jesus' reading of Psalm, or his reciting of Psalm 22:1? Is this a cry of abandonment or a cry of victory? In verse 38, we find that the temple of the curtain is torn from top to bottom, kind of symbolic that God has torn the temple. It wasn't torn from the bottom up like a man or a woman would do it, but from the top down, so that the barrier between the Holy of Holies, where God dwells, and humanity is torn apart. Again, scholars have read this symbolically, saying that this is symbolic that now we have access to God, that the curtain of separation between us and him has been torn away by God, obliterated by God, so that we can come in and have access to him. And I certainly believe that barrier between us and him has been separated. But the question, and I put this in the guide, is this a symbol of our being allowed into the presence of God? Or is it a symbol of God breaking out to be able to give us all access by coming out to us? Remember what Jesus did in coming. He didn't wait for us to come to him. He came to us. Remember that Jesus has been giving pronouncement after pronouncement of judgment on the temple, this temple system that kept God confined in this small space where only the high priest could come into his presence, and only once a year, and that they had built on kind of stratifying access to God depending on your social status, your ethnicity, your gender, that it kept people further and further away from God. Is it possible that what is happening here is not us being allowed in to the Holy of Holies, but rather God breaking out to us? So you could let your group talk about that and talk about what that means about God. If in fact what's happening is that God will not be confined. He's coming out to us. Last section of this passage has to do with Joseph of Arimathea. I think it is an important thing to talk about. He's not the main focus of this passage, but to talk about what we learn from what he does here, the risks that he's taking, the cost that he's willing to pay. And there's some other questions here too about the factual nature of Jesus's death and burial, so that he really did actually die. As in all of these passages, never forget to spend time on application, to talk about how is God meeting us in this passage? How can we respond to him in this passage? Have some questions written down here, ways that you might respond to God. But think about, together as a group, how is God speaking to us? And what might it look like for us to respond to him? Well, you're getting close to the end of Mark. My hope is that if it hasn't started already, that things will eventually come together in your understanding of Mark. Take some time to look at that final study. So not just the Mark 16 passage, but the final review study, to see if you might want to do them together, and to think about kind of what are some of the great themes that hold Mark together. What is it that that God has revealed to us about Jesus in this book, and how do we want to help our people to respond to that? Well, God bless you as you continue your study of Mark, as well as investing in the lives of men and women, um, helping them to learn what you've learned about what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Um, I'm just praying that God is going to give you what you need to be able to do that.